So the question is, following 2 decades of conflict in the Middle East, where does SOF and DoD go from here? Well, from day one at the Department of Defense, our overriding objectives have been clear. Restore the warrior ethos, rebuild our military, and reestablish deterrence. It all starts with restoring the warrior ethos. When President Trump asked me to take this job, he told me, well, one key thing, but really two. The first was, Pete, you're gonna have to be tough as shit. They're gonna come after you. Boy, he was not kidding about that one. This job requires a steel spine, and that's fine. My job's easy compared to what you do. We're doing the work on behalf of the American people and the American warfighter. But then the president, after he said that, went on to say, I need you and I want you to restore the warrior ethos in our military, full stop. And that's been my first priority since day one, is restoring the warrior ethos. It's one of the most fundamental of those 3 objectives. Again, humans more important than hardware. Everything starts and ends with warriors from training to the battlefield. We are leaving wokeness and weakness behind. No more pronouns, no more climate change obsession, no more emergency vaccine mandates, no more dudes in dresses. We're done with that shit.
Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
Anybody in this country doesn't minimize their tax. They want their heads rent.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
The answer is, Mike, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Stephen Tripp. Thank you to everyone who is watching this. If you are watching this live on Facebook and YouTube, you can contribute to the chat, and the link to StreamYard is also in the chat if you want to call in and have your say and maybe ask a question. We're having a little bit of a problem with the Rumble tonight. For some reason, that's not going through. So if we can't get that to work, I'll get the Rumble uploaded later. Hopefully we can get that working so we can be joined by all the people that follow us on Rumble. But hello to everyone on Facebook and YouTube. Let's kick things off because we've got a really great discussion with a returning guest tonight. And I'll kick it off by letting you know how you can support us. Best place to go is commandingthenarrative.com. If you want to donate to us, you can hit the donate button. Some people like to donate through Buy Me a Coffee. Some people like the direct route. Whatever you choose, it helps to pay for the stream. It helps to pay for the website. And most importantly, gives me a very warm and fuzzy feeling inside. And while you're there at commandingthenarrative.com on the homepage, you can keep up to date with all our podcasts, articles, newsletters, upcoming podcasts and events. It's all there. You can get a weekly newsletter just by hitting the sign up button in the top right hand corner, and it's really the best place to go to keep up to date with everything that we're doing. Also coming up, we've got a big event for Australians for Better Government. Please head to australiansforbetter.com. I'm calling this the next step. I think this is going to be an important event to discuss the future of Australian politics and our system of government straight after the federal election. A lot of people are feeling a little bit lost after the federal election. Of course, there's people out there that probably feel very excited about what happened at the election if you're a Labor supporter. But this is going to be about addressing our system of government and reforming our system of government, and it's going to be a great day. So if you can come along, it's at the Warrawee Club on Sunday, May 25th. Starts at noon. We're going to have the Honourable John Ruddick, leader of the Libertarian Party in New South Wales. He's going to be speaking. He's very good on political history. We're going to have Darren de Bortley from de Bortley Wines, who that's going to be interesting for me because this is the first time I've heard someone from the business community talk about these issues. He's outside of politics, so that's going to be great to hear. Kevin Lockray, a co-founder of Australians for Better Government, is coming down from Ballina to speak, and he's always fantastic. We've had him on the show before, and I will also be there. And we're going to have a raffle. We've got some great prizes, a selection of de Bortley Wines, $500 Pillow Talk gift voucher, and of some other prizes also to be announced. So if you can head to australiansforbetter.com and follow the links to buy tickets, we'd love to see you there at that event. And that's it for me for now. So we better get into it. We've got returning guest, Dr. Christopher Reynolds. If you want to hear more about Dr. Chris, you can head back to previous episodes, number 58 and also 64. Episode 58, we discussed his book, A Capital Idea, which focuses on pre-1901 history of Australia. And that was probably our most well-received podcast that we have done, at least for a long time. People loved that episode with Dr. Christopher Reynolds. And also episode 68 was on some geopolitical things with the US, Europe, Australia, and what that means with the war in Ukraine and some of the other conflicts around the world. That was a really great episode as well. Today, we're going to be talking about the Australian Constitution, the history of the Constitution, the formation of the Constitution, and also Federation, and also how it's progressed over time and maybe some things that we can reform our system. And I think it's important to have Dr. Christopher Reynolds speak about this because he actually has a PhD in constitutional law. And he's the only Australian that has worked in both the Australian political system, but also the United States political system in both the Congress and the Senate. And he had very strong links to the White House as well. So we're very privileged to be able to have him on tonight and to hear from him. So let's welcome him on. Dr. Christopher Reynolds, welcome back to Commanding the Narrative, mate.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
And tell us, you also received a letter from King Charles this week, is that right?
Yes, I got a letter back from His Majesty, and he says, if I can remember it, he wants to greatly thank me that I've gone to such trouble to share with him a copy of my new book. So I think that letter's going straight to the pool room.
Very good. So if you're wondering, this is the book. You can head to reynoldslearning.com. What a Capital Idea. I've got my own copy here that I'm going to be quoting from tonight. It's a great book, and I encourage everyone to head to your website, Dr. Reynolds, and get this book because you're getting fabulous feedback from everywhere, aren't you?
Yeah, I've done more than, I think it's, I must be close to 70 speaking engagements in 1 year. And, I'm doing it day by day. I get up and I say, where am I going today? Did a radio yesterday, a Provost group. No, it wasn't. It was a Rotary group early in the week. And then I was down in Sydney last Sunday with the First Fleeters. And these people, I thought, the First Fleeters, what am I going to tell them? And they clapped me 3 times. And the last time, they were on their feet clapping me. I mean, all I could do was sort of laugh with joy. And they rushed forward. They grabbed the books and they were hugging them. And it was almost a fight to see who was going to get the book. I mean, it is fantastic to see people responding and wanting to take hold of pride in this country. And all I am doing, I didn't write this thing with any political agenda at all. I just started to look for the truth of what actually happened because I was so disgusted with what historians have been writing in the last 30 odd years, where they've just been sharing around the same nonsense. And so I just sort of jumped in to actually sort it all out in the same quality of work as I would have presented to the White House. So that's the sort of document. But it's easy to read. There's a bit of humor along the way as well. And I put in all these photographs so you can actually see what you're reading. So I think I've sold, I must be up to 1,700, 1,800 books I've sold in a year. And that's this big book. But again, if people are able to somehow get it on the website and find where to put in the code, if they can enter the code 1770, I can give them a 25% discount on the price.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, I can't do much better than that, mate. You know.
No, and it's a big book. Like here it is. Here
It's a big book. I know. Yeah.
Wealth of knowledge in there. So I encourage everyone to do that. And I gave you a bit of an intro as to why we've got you on tonight to talk about the Constitution. Is there anything that you want to expand upon that? I mean, having a PhD in constitutional law is significant, I think. But is there anything else that you want to add to that?
Yeah, because it wasn't just. I mean, to go and work for the US Congress is to learn the process, how it works, and what you're doing. I was writing legislation for the US Congress. I was managing those hearings that you see. You know, often you'll see the senators come in and they're having a hearing, and you'll see the people sitting behind them against the wall. Well, they're the people that have actually organised what the senator's saying. He just walks in and opens a book, and it's all written for them. So there's somebody that's pulled that whole show together. So that's what I was doing in the Congress, and then with the Senate. And then because of the quality of my work, I had two things I wrote that the White House just picked up and made into law without it going through the legislature. And eventually the president sent me a letter, himself sent me a letter thanking me, an Australian, 33 years old, and he writes to me and thanks me for my excellent work and wishes that he had more people like me working in the Congress. So I was very close to the White House, but I know the American system of government and how it actually works. And of course, I worked here as well, and I know the differences in the practical sense apart from what's written on the paper.
I know I've spoken to you behind the scenes about the differences between the American system and the Australian system, and they're light and day for you, aren't they?
They're what?
They're vastly different. Like the difference between the two systems.
Oh, well, that's where you cross your arms and you get out your sherry and you have a bit of a think about it as you stare at the ceiling. And we're going to fall into this, and I'm going to tell you how closely similar they are, with some fundamental differences that makes our system difficult to operate. So yes, when you're ready, we can start into this topic.
Yeah, well, how about you want to lead with a quote, right?
Yeah, I do. You're going to like this one. Ready for this?
Yeah.
This is out of a book, chapter 27.
Yeah.
Now, this, by the way, let me remind people, this is not sort of an easy sort of a topic, you know? I mean, who wants to sort of spend the night thinking about the Constitution? And when I came to write this chapter, I thought, the Constitution, how am I going to make this sort of pleasurable that people are going to want to read it? So if you follow it along, you're actually going to enjoy me talking about our Constitution. So just sort of hang on, get yourself that sherry, and follow this along, right? Here comes the first quote.
Yep.
A democracy is a state where the free men and the poor, being in the majority, are invested with the power of the state. The most pure democracy is that is in which is called so principally from the equality that prevails in it. For this is what the law is in that it directs, that the poor shall be in no greater subjection than the rich, nor the supreme power shall be lodged in either of these, but that both shall have it. Now, here's a description of democracy. But the thing is that it was written by Aristotle 2,500 years ago. Right? And here he is with political science talking about the functions of democracy and equality and the vestments of power 2,500 years ago. So you can see that, it's not an easy subject, and people have been thinking about it for quite some time. But let me jump in a bit and say, when we actually look at our Constitution, which was an act of the British Parliament in 1901, there were three things as we sort of move towards this that need to be considered. The first two are obvious. One is political will, that it took 50 years for the colonies to actually have the will to federate. The second one was finance. There was the benefit factor. Who is going to benefit if we federate? And that caused a lot of trouble. So the third factor is the history of how they actually got to a point of writing up this document before we get to the incredible fellow from Tasmania that actually wrote it. So let me just sort of jump back and say, right, here's the history lesson. It's around the 1850s. Now, there was a fellow from the British Parliament that wrote to some Australians, William Wentworth and a couple of others, and he said, we in the British Parliament, a bit like the Mushroom Club, it's sort of the Prime Minister and his mates are making all the decisions, but we're kept pretty much in the dark of what goes on in Australia. Do you think you could set up some sort of an association to help us be informed? And this then formed the Australian Patriarchal, or some other word, Association. And I thought, oh, here's the first step forward for democracy. But it wasn't. It was established, it was initiated by a British parliamentarian. And these gentlemen that formed the committee then worked for, what did I say, about the 1840s, 50s. They then worked for the next decade or so to actually bring about the writing of the New South Wales Constitution. Now, this becomes really important. And I think Britain was preparing the way for it, because in 1850, it passed an act to allow for, I think I've got it right, the establishment of the New South Wales, you get the Assembly and the Council.
Yeah, the Legislative Assembly, which is the lower house.
You're in New South Wales. You remind me, right? And they could advise the governor. And it was also in that act that it made way for the separation of the states Tasmania, which was the second state, and then Victoria, and then South Australia, Western Australia, and eventually Queensland followed. So a few years later, Wentworth and his friends had sat down, or they hadn't, they argued across the parliament, to tell you the truth. They argued across the parliament about what a constitution should look like. Now, out of that debate came two houses, a bicameral system that we still have, a lower house, or the Assembly in New South Wales, and a council. So they got to vote for the lower house, the Assembly, which of course we still do, and the Senate eventually was appointed by the governor. Now here then, the other colonies copied that document. Now this becomes important because they were all acts of the British Parliament, and each of the colonies was separate. And they argued over everything. They had different stamps. They even had different times. So while it was midday in New South Wales, oh no, it wasn't in Victoria. They're counting that, watching the stars differently, different railway gauges, and so it went on. That the states were competing for money because they were looking for foreign investment, and this then becomes the business about the benefit factor, because they were all very heavily engaged in getting foreign investment, British money, both to the government and the private sector. So the government was the largest borrower, building infrastructure, but it also ran banks and butcher shops and all sorts of things. Karl Marx would have been incredibly impressed with the way our colonies were functioning back then. He'd probably be impressed today too, but that's another thing. Yeah. So you've got this business of the competition between the states. So there's a problem with political will. So by the time we're moving up to the 1891, there had been a depression. And so the states were even in more competition. But Victoria, and I mean massive amounts of them, it was, there was 5 million people in the country, about 5 or 6 million. And the debt had over just 10 to 20 years gone from like £5,000 or something to £200,000. We're now talking billions of dollars in debt. And here comes the depression that hit England and Australia, a recession here, a drought in Australia. And this then meant all those people sort of saying we want better working conditions and we want jobs, and unions on the street all fell apart because you were lucky to have a job. Now, the situation was that Victoria was in such debt and collapsing that it suddenly wanted to federate with the other colonies in the hope that it could pass its debt across to the federal government. And as I read this, I thought, nothing's changed much in all those years. It's still in a massive amount of debt, and still trying to get the federal government, which it is, to bail it out at every corner. So we got a
little bit of a background before that. Victoria actually was the wealthiest state because of the gold rush.
You're right. It was, and it become the most wealthy because of the mines and BHP and the gold. And I mean, there were a tremendous number of people that came in at the gold rush. Now, here was something that, I kept reading in the history books about European settlement. European settlement. It wasn't the Europeans that got off the boats in Sydney Cove. And there were no Europeans that were ever governors. And I thought, the gold rush, when the gold rush, that's maybe when all the Europeans came, one would think. Well, I got hold of a survey that was done in 56, just as the gold rush was finishing, 57, somewhere in there. And only 2%, what was that? 2% of the nation came from anywhere else other than Britain. There was no European settlement. And indeed, Sydney was settled, Hobart was settled, Newcastle, Brisbane, Western Australia and Darwin were all settled to keep out the Europeans, the French and the Germans. And we, using the law of terra nullius, that people think is not much of a law at all, we, Australia, used the law of terra nullius to take New Guinea. Right?
Yeah, see, you raise a good point, because it just shows how historically incompetent these people are.
Oh, yeah, they are.
If you do put it back into that context, like in Great Britain, France, Germany, and all the other European nations were constantly at war with each other, like trying to get these different territories. They weren't coming here all together and working together. And all they were trying to keep each other out.
Well, that becomes chapter 1, you see, because I got asked to do this book, and you think, it all starts when Arthur Phillip lands on the beach. Oh, no, it didn't. It all, and my head was in a spin with all these European countries fighting each other. And you'd have 4 countries versus 5, and then 10 years later, it had all changed again, and I just couldn't keep up. I really had to keep really strict on the dates of who was fighting who. And it was like the Monty Python business, let's not argue about who killed who. And away I went on. So, of course, to bring on the Australian thing, we're off the topic a bit. As I said before, is that when the First Fleet left as plan A to do something about the French possibly coming down to India, not Australia. They were interested in India and taking over the Dutch settlements and trade. And the closest port that you can find that's not India just happens to be Sydney. You think, you're 1,000 miles or 2,000 kilometres at least away from India. But that was the closest, viable port. It's very strange. But 2 weeks after that, I may have mentioned, there was a secret meeting in the Brooks Club in London, and there were 4 men, and I got their names, the barons and viscounts, and these fellas sat down, and Baron James Harris put to Prime Minister Pitt, I have a plan to bring down the French. Pitt listened to it, and he said, how much do you want? Now, we just spent £87,000 for the First Fleet, and Harris says, I want £70,000, almost as much as it cost him for the First Fleet. And the Prime Minister says, it'll be in your bank by Friday. And with that money, within 5 months, he brought down the French government, and it led to the French Revolution. And it never comes out that this was the money again was so significant in getting us started. No one has ever heard that whole story, and by the time Philip got here, the British didn't need the New South Wales settlement. And we've never been told the real history. So here we are again, coming up to our constitution issue. And let's, if we can open this up so that we can see what was actually happening with the context. So the thing, all right?
Yeah, go on, keep going. Yep.
Yeah. The thing was that here are these states all in competition for money, They don't like each other. The British are sick to death of the colonies constantly whinging. Earl Grey had been almost for 50 years saying, please, will you federate? Well, I'm sick to death of the letters that I constantly get and your constant complaints. Please, will you federate? So, all right, they got up to this point and they're about to do it because they're broke, all right? So I read that this convention in 1891, which was the only real convention that they had. Others
quickly,
yeah.
just so you're saying they were broke. How could federating have helped that? They were looking for capital from overseas capital, right? Like how would that
they were, and also the companies wanted to deal with something bigger than the little colonies. So the whole idea was that if you had one nation, we could be lending to the nation. It was a bigger body to be dealing with and one lot of loans, etc. So they could see, because there's also the precedent with what happened with Canada in 1867. So it's 40 years later, and they like what happened with Canada. And this brings us to a point in a minute. So that was there in the background, that Canada had been rather successful. So all right, they're going to have this convention and they're going to go on for a month. Now, I don't know whether you've had the displeasure of going to a conference even for 3 days. You wriggle around and you think, oh no, when will he finish? And you look at when are we having a break? So if you went for 3 days, these guys were going to have a conference that went for a month. Oh, right. Anyway, what happens is, in the background, behind these warring states, colonies, down in Tasmania, there's a young fellow by the name of Inglis Clark. And Andrew, for some reason, was a member of Parliament and also the Attorney General. But he had a private interest in in the American Constitution and constitutional law. And he formed an American club. Now, I had to think about this. I thought, well, in Tasmania, how many members would you get? You sort of had to pack the meetings with a few seals and whatever else you could get. It's not a place you'd usually think to have a big group going on. Anyway, he had to go off and defend Tasmania against somebody who was suing them in London. And on the way back, he stopped in Washington to talk to some people about the ideas he had and what was going on in Australia. So he had time on the boat a ship back into Sydney, and he arrived the week before the convention. So here's this convention, and there's Griffith from Queensland, and there's Deakin from New South Wales. How are you, George? Haven't seen you in so long. And there's Henry over there, or Harry, and how are you getting on, Harry? And what did you call that state of yours again? Oh, yes, South Australia and Adelaide. Oh, yes, well, it won't be long before after morning tea time, and we'll all get stuck into it, I'm sure, soon. And, of course, we don't have a blasted idea what we're going to do with the Constitution, do we, really? So in this room with all of these premiers and all talking about their debts, walks young Inglis Clark. And he comes over to the table. Oh, and who are you? He opens his satchel and he pulls out 98 clauses for a constitution. He had written it. And they're just sitting there looking at this thing, flipping the pages. And while they were doing that in absolute shock, he then says, have you thought of a name? And they went, what, a name? Well, he said, you are federating. You're going to have to think of a name for your country. Oh, I suppose we do. And he said, well, what about the Commonwealth of Australia? What? A Commonwealth of Australia? Well, yes, that's what Britain does. It has the Commonwealth of Virginia and the Commonwealth of Philadelphia and the Commonwealth of Delaware. I think we should call it the Commonwealth of Australia. Oh, yeah, I suppose we should. So while they were pondering that, he opened his satchel again. He pulled out an old rag. Where are we there? Pulled out an old rag, and he held up this rag and he says, and what about this for the flag for the nation? And they just stared at it. This one man gave us the flag, the name, and 98 clauses, 75% of our existing constitution. And I'd never heard of him.
I've never heard of him until researching.
We only have one founding father, and that's Inglis Clark.
Well, we
The
always
others-
hear about Sir Henry Parkes. Why is so much emphasis put on him? Like he's
Well, I think it was
father
because
of
he was in
Federation.
New South Wales. But Henry Park was a thorough royalist. I've heard the Labor Party talk about his speech out at Tennant's or something. Where is it? Somebody's Creek?
Tenterfield.
Thank you very much. And, and they think they go on about how he was this man that brought about democracy. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. He actually made a speech about us federating and how it was necessary, but the crimson thread runs through us all was his phrase. And he was as British, and of course he was British himself. But by the time they got to to Federate, Parkes had been dead for 5 years. He had nothing to do with it.
Got a copy. So I got a question here from Graham, or a statement. He says, written it or copied it in regards to Andrew Inglis.
Where can he get a copy of it?
No. So what Graham's asking or saying is, so Andrew Inglis Clark came in with this copy of the Constitution that he'd written. Graham is asking, did he actually write it or did he copy it from somewhere?
No, he wrote it. Because there was nothing else in our context that you could copy, which is what we're getting to in a minute. Now, he was aware, and we're going to talk about this, of the American situation, but also the British precedent, because Britain was not about to give up control, not so much of the domestic politics, but nobody was going to tell Britain what to do with its policies. And Britain was not about to give up commercial subordination. So Disraeli at one point in Parliament said that colonies may become independent, but they don't really become independent. And he's referring to the fact of the commercial links that were there. So they can have their own constitution, but as long as we maintain control over the finance, we are really in control. And so even with our constitution, as it passes through the British Parliament, something that was added was that even if a state did not like what was happening with the federal government, they could protest and go to the Privy Council above our federal government. Now, you may remember that Bjelke Petersen, when he got in up here in Queensland, just thought that was lovely. He brought on more complaints to the Privy Council than the rest of Australian history. He didn't like the Labor government, and eventually they were going, it was the British Supreme Court of the Privy Council when it came to Australia. And so it was still there. Eventually we had to, do something about that and stop people running off to the Privy Council, but they were not giving up control over the finance. And that's what was going on with the precedent behind the American, as Clark looked at both the American document. But we'll get around that in a minute.
Yeah, well, we've got another comment from Graham that might address some of this, and if it doesn't, we'll go into it a bit later. Graham says, much of our federal constitution comes out of the US Constitution, so they were heavily influenced by the US Constitution.
It does. And yes, it does, but there's more to it. You see, let me pick up on his comment. And what he's saying is that we, like Canada and the United States, were going to become a federation of colonies. So the big problem was, as I was pointing out, the colonies weren't giving up nothing for nobody to nobody. So you had to pick up the American principle that which is not granted is retained. So the states in America, like if you just take even, let me pick something that's notable, is the abortion law. Now, the federal government under Liberal Democrats said, we're going to make this law and we're going to tell the country what to do. Now, then it finally comes back to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, no, this is a health issue that is a state issue, and we've got nothing to do with it. So yes, there was this principle of that which is not granted is retained. Now that's one of the fundamental principles that was in and is in the American Constitution and in our parliamentary thing. Now, here's the other one, and that's the separation of powers. But this is where it starts to get really murky for Australia. Now, the separation of powers goes back to the Magna Carta, where the barons all told the king that we want to say in the government. And eventually you get the courts, the legislature, and the executive officer. Now, in America, the executive officer is the president. And we see that he's elected separately. And the Senate then has the right to vet through who's going to actually be secretaries of state. So now it's all settled down, and the secretaries of state, who are supposedly experts in their field, have run off to do the president's bidding. If the Congress doesn't like it, then they can write a law to rescind what he's doing, or they can stop, like they did with Nixon with his war powers. They can pass a legislation and take those powers away from him. But this is sort of there with the Australian situation. Now, with the background I was trying to get onto was that the English political philosophy had moved from a mercantile situation where the government just sat back and said, well, you can go and have a colony, and it's mercantile, is a merchant, it's merchandise is what's happening. So this is where we get this word. So these joint stock companies, like in Virginia, ran off and started a colony, and the British said, well, we'll send troops to protect you, but you can only trade back to Britain. So with this business, it then moved through this laissez-faire sort of thing, and it was thinking about democracy. But the time we get close to our federation, the British government has basically granted the power or the right to representative government. Now, representative government is where we vote for our representatives in the parliament, right? But there was a new policy that they were thinking about called responsible government, not representative, responsible. And this is where it was a compromise, where the Governor General would be responsible to the monarch. Whatever the monarch said, he was her representative. But at the same time, he was responsible to the parliament, that it was only in unusual circumstances or something that he had individual powers, but mostly he would be responsible to the will of the parliament. But the parliament at the same time had to be responsible what they did back to the Governor General, in as much as it is the Governor General that signs the documents. Now, I know that on Thursday evenings in New South Wales, then somebody is sent down to have a wine with the governor, and they sit around and have a chat and how things are going, and he just signs the documents. Now, the big case in Australia's history with all of this is Kerr, Governor General Kerr, where he said, well, I don't think I want to sign that. I know I can read here in the book that I've got these powers, and I'm sending that back, and the parliament can have another look at it because I don't like it. And of course, then he dismissed Whitlam, well, may you say, God save the Governor General. And I'm going to say, God Whitlam, and go say John Kerr. So that's where we get the conflict. But Kerr was right in what he did, in terms of the way the Constitution is written, and he does have those powers. But we've moved up to this position of responsible government. So when Clark comes to write this document, he does several things. Firstly, he's aware of the separation of powers. So he actually uses the same word, executive section, the parliament, the executive, the parliament, and the judiciary. Boom. So he's got that Magna Carta principle of the separation of the three powers written in our Constitution, just like the Americans. Then in the executive section, it goes through this business of representative government. And it also, of course, starts off acknowledging that we've been founded under God's provision. So it's a Christian document right up front. Now, in that executive, what I'm talking about with those powers, it gets confusing as you read the statutory powers, the powers he's given, and what's called reserve powers, or the powers that come to him also from the letters patent. So they're powers that the Queen was giving, and I haven't checked it, But since we have now a new government and recently a new Governor General, there would have been new letters patent issued. They haven't stopped. The monarch continues to issue letters patent to now his representative in Australia, defining those powers. So that's still a real aspect of our system. Now, there's several things then that we have this principle, as I said, of the powers that are retained by the states. So there's something that happens at this point. So we are like America, but when it gets to England, I think someone adds a verse or a sentence in 64, section 64. And the second sentence is that all secretaries of state, which we now call ministers, the secretaries of, you go find it for me.
Yes, so number 64, as you said. So
I'm guessing I better be right now that I've said that.
Yeah. So 64 says the Governor General may appoint officers to administer such departments of state of the Commonwealth as the Governor General in council may establish. Such officials shall hold office during the pleasure of the Governor General. They shall be members of the Federal Executive Council and shall be the Queen's Ministers of State of the Commonwealth. So that sounds great until it gets to this point here. Ministers to sit in Parliament. After the first general election, no Minister of State shall hold office for a longer period than 3 months unless he is or becomes a senator or a member of the House of Representatives. So that's the clause that screws everything up, right?
That is exactly right. So if we did not have that, we would be much closer to the American system. But we see what that clause is actually saying and telling what the Constitution tells us is that there is no recognized, designated authority in the Constitution for a Prime Minister. And there is no recognized authority or body politic in the Constitution for a political party. Oh, yeah. See, so what we've done in our own convention is brought them in, but they're not constitutionally legal.
But this, okay, we need to expand this. So firstly, this clause, right? So in chapter 2 is all about the executive of government. So to explain it in layman's terms, you've got the legislature, which is the House of Representatives and the Senate. That's the Parliament, bicameral system. A lot of people think that's the separation of powers that we have, but that's not fundamentally correct. That legislature is meant to pass the laws, and then the executive branch of government is meant to implement the laws once those laws are passed. And then the judiciary oversees that from a legal standpoint to see if it's constitutional, blah, blah, blah. Now, chapter 2 details the executive and how it's meant to be run. The Governor General is meant to run that department, etc. It doesn't mention the Prime Minister or any members of Parliament, apart from this one clause saying that if you're a head of the department, you have to be a member of Parliament. So what it's basically saying, if you want to be a minister, say you're a health minister or climate change minister, you have to be a member of Parliament. Where in America, it's different. Donald Trump, president, is essentially our Governor General, and then he can appoint people to each department.
No, stop.
Okay.
He nominates to the Senate.
Yes, yeah.
And then the Senate can go through. There was a guy called Howard Meese who was a used car salesman, and he was a friend of Ronald Reagan's. So when Ronald got in, he said, "Oh, I want my mate Meese to be the Attorney General." And the Senate took a year to go over his credentials before they were forced to do it. And it's actually under Meese that you ended up with Watergate. So, he really made a mess of it as a used car salesman.
But the power of this is that if we had a system closer to the Americans, the Governor General would be able to appoint people from outside of Parliament to be the head of different departments. So if you want someone like Peter Cosgrove to be the Minister of Defence, you can do that. He doesn't have to be a member of Parliament. But this one clause says you have to select from the members of Parliament, which means
Yeah, it reads to me, Steve, when I looked at this and studied it all, and every other principle like that, that's a major important thing, has a number because it's so important. So that sentence, I would, argue and put down and say I'm speculating, but it reads to me like it was added later.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't fit. That sentence is out of alignment with everything else that Inglis Clark did. He could see, like the Americans, and it worked, that the president could appoint those in council to work for him, just as it already had. You see, that's what was happening under the governors of the states anyway. They had councils and they had people that they nominated to come into council and run the government. And that's what was happening. It wasn't the people in the parliament. So it was the same principle in America as it was historically in the colonies. So that one sentence neutralized it.
And that one sentence leads to people like Chris Bowen being our Minister for Climate Change and Energy and having no prior experience or knowledge or anything about climate change and energy. Or you have a health minister or a defense minister that's never run a business, never even worked in that field.
Yeah.
Getting a department with thousands of bureaucrats and billions of dollars in budget.
Yeah, shocking. Now, here's another thing that's important with all of this. There's two things. When the Act goes through Parliament, and remember we had a referendum, and stop again, Chris, when we voted in a referendum to become a nation and to federate, firstly, everybody over the age of 21 was able to vote, male and female. And that included Aborigines. Aborigines voted along with everybody else for federation in their states. And there's another issue, if we wanted to, as to why they got cancelled out of the census. Their voting rights is only because I cut out of the census because Western Australia and South Australia decided that if they counted the Aboriginal populations in outback areas that nobody could get out and count anyway and probably didn't speak English, they could get more representatives in the Federal House of Representatives. And New South Wales and Victoria said, not on your bloody life are you going to do that. And so I think it's 128 they wrote in and said, you can't count full-blood Aborigines. Now, if you read it, it still allows, as they called them, mixed-breed Aborigines to continue to vote. It was only a sentiment against those two states and trying to pack the parliament. So firstly, we've got everybody votes, and I don't know whether any other country before us had actually voted in a referendum for everybody to become a nation. I mean, America only had 3% of its country actually vote for independence. Only 3% voted. So that was the first thing. Now, the other thing, and it's somewhat of a misnomer, that we think we voted for democracy. Now, we do, in principle, vote, and therefore we own that government. It's our government, and we just voted again we could have replaced it, which means that Australia owns this country. We are a sovereign country. And the third thing is we have legally one flag, not many. And we're not a divided nation as such with multiple different election processes, whatever else, and one flag, etc. We are one sovereign nation. Now, while that's all true, and we think we voted for democracy, there are those who would want to point out that, no, we didn't. We voted for a referendum for the British Parliament to make an act and create Australia as another colony. And so we became, as a nation, another British colony. So even today, because the constitutions of those colonies still stand for the states, we are, as one Supreme Court judge taking up this issue pointed out, we are a country of shared sovereignty. So it was strange. You got to watch what you do. If you hold a referendum, for a republic, you'd have to get it to pass through each of the states, because it was the states that created the federal government. And the federal government, as such, doesn't have the power to take away the powers of the states. When King Charles became king, they had a ceremony in Canberra to acknowledge that he was now the King of Australia. You know, the band marched and they blew the trumpets and, you know, and watched the wind or the flags blow. Well, they also held one of those ceremonies in each of the states. And I took such joy watching it in Queensland as the Labor Premier came out with her Labor-appointed Governor-General, and there they were, and they had to read the document that had been sent to them and acknowledge that King Charles is the King of Queensland. And he is the King of South Australia and Western Australia. They have independent sovereignty rights. And even when we came to, what was the year? Was it 86, 87, and 93, where we had the Australia Act pass?
1988.
Was it?
88. Yeah, 1988. I'll look it up.
No, it's 80. It's an odd 6. I would have.
Or maybe it was 86. Oh, yeah, I mean, you might be right. Actually, maybe it is 86. Australia Act.
Yeah, you look up things.
Yeah.
90. No.
Now, yeah, sorry. The Australia Act was 1986. Yes.
Oh, good. I'm glad I can.
Yeah. Right.
What actually happens in that? There was another convention, and the Labor Party was running it, and they want independence so badly, and there's nothing much we can do. But we'll pass another Australia Act, and we'll finally cut the string. And Britain will say, you know, my husband and I are hereby declaring that we want nothing more to do with Australian politics. Please go away. Please go away. Please go away. Right. My husband and I. But they passed it in Australia at the same time, and it went to each of the states. Now, while I read and was forced to read, as it were, this is what we've now done in Australia. Oh, says Chris to himself, let me have a look at what the British actually wrote. Oh, it was slightly different. And what actually passed in Britain doesn't have the same sentences as it does with Australia, because it basically says, my husband and I are hereby giving independence of Australia. We really hope they go away and stop bothering us with all the stuff that we've had to put up with for centuries. But while we are relinquishing those powers for the federal government, we ain't getting anywhere near relinquishing the powers that we have over the states. And if we show up with any of the states, you are to roll out the red carpet as usual and get down on your knees and kiss the carpet as we come down off the plane. It doesn't say that the states are giving up their powers. And that's made clear in the English version of that legislation we call the Australia Act.
How does that make any sense?
Well, because I'm saying those institutions called the colonial governments, you'd have to have them repealed in the British Parliament. And the Parliament's not going to do that. So the state would have to write to the British government, not our federal government, and say, please, will you now make us something else other than a colony? So we have a system of shared sovereignty where the states have some powers and the federal government have others. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful mess, mate.
So you're saying that's the reason why, like, say, for example, the states look after health.
Yeah, it is, and it's not. It comes out of that blue they were having with competition. And this was an issue that Inglis was very successful in able to get around, where he could, smell what was happening or could sense. And so he like the American system that nobody else had thought about, said, let the states retain those things that they really need. And again, you may notice that the states still have a right to be borrowing money. So we have a federal debt now greater than we've ever had at $1 trillion. That's the federal debt alone. So you don't hear what each of the states are, but I understand that Victoria's again in a real mess down there.
Let's discuss quickly state constitutions, because state constitutions are only changed through acts of parliament. They can't be changed through referendum. Is that got links to this lineage?
I think that is right. I've got to think about it's Canada. It's going else. But I think you're right. Now, when I look at the New South Wales, if I may take an example, as the oldest constitution was written by William Wentworth, which I'm about to write up in this new thing I'm writing called Leaders and Larrikins, Great Australian Stories. So I'm about to get into William Wentworth and find the man himself, because he's a currency lad, and he's very pro democracy for Australia's independence. But England called him the only political scientist in the nation. So when he shows up in 1855, with this document, they're talking to William Wentworth, the Parliament, the Senate is, and the government is. And they decide, well, he really knows what he's talking about. He understands the system. Now, when I went and looked at it in terms of amendments, I found that in that 170 years of that Constitution's existence, there have been only 9 amendments to it, and each of them are little procedural things. There have been no fundamental changes to the New South Wales Constitution since it was written by William Wentworth. So that's really quite something, that they haven't played around with it at all. But anyway, ask me a question about that Constitution.
No, well, it was more that if we wanted to make reforms to the state constitutions, if we wanted to say, okay, we're going to make the state constitutions more like the Australian Constitution, where if you want any word changed in there, it has to go to a referendum. It has to be voted by the people. Could we do that, or would we have to go back to the British?
Well, again, lobby your congressman, as the Americans say. If you got enough parliamentarians on side and you had a big enough protest on the steps, they would be listening, and they do. I remember years ago when I was in public relations, to take this last election, there was talk about how one of the people that lost the election was listening too much to the pollsters. But in public relations, the question was, well, ask me what the people think. Tell me, what do you want them to think? I'm in PR. That's what I'm going to do. You need to educate people, inform them, let the debate go on, whatever you want. If they want them all to eat Kellogg's cornflakes, then you watch me go to town on that. And then at the end of the month, Neville Rand was very good at this. And at the end of the month, she says, I think we'll have everybody eat Kellogg's cornflakes. I think that's a good idea. But, of course, the campaign had run before you got there. So it is possible to get the New South Wales to do something. The danger is that you can have people that come in, and I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's toes. Let's say if you had a political party that seemed to have a particular colour as their logo, like purple, not green, and they wanted to influence the parliament in the Constitution, they could. But I think that the Constitution mainly has to do with structural types of things, such as the division between the Legislative Council and the Assembly. It's not to do with powers thereof for the participants.
Yeah, okay. I got a comment from Evan. You might want to address this. Evan says, we have a fake constitution voted by the British government, empowered by them, not accepted or voted on by the Australian people.
Yes and no. Firstly, the people in Australia were British subjects. There was no noticeable dissent in this country, except for people, a minor group who are Irish and Scottish rebels who didn't like the British no matter where they were at this time. The referendum we had was for us to say yes to federation. Each of the states colonies had, through those constitutional conventions, had 10 years to amend what Inglis Clark had said. So each of the colony leaders had accepted that document. They then say to the people, we're going to vote. Now, remember, it wasn't a federal government that put this referendum. It was each of the states independently informing their people. And again, people weren't idiots. There were lots of people that said, well, what's in it? Can we read it? And they would have. So they fully understood what they were doing. But we were under, the colonies were all British colonies. So what I was pointing out was that as we become a federation, it was still an act of the British Parliament for us to become recognised as a nation. Now, when we come to look at our history of the road to independence, there are actually 4 documents that make up that independence that Australia has. 1, the Constitution; 2, the Statute of Westminster; 3, January 26, 1949, the Constitution, the Citizenship Act, and then the one we talked about in 1986, which is the Australia Act. Now, the Statute of Westminster, again, we recognise it as telling Australia, you can now go and make your own declaration of war. And there was the Balfour Declaration even before that. England was saying again to the colonies, please go away. We can't afford to look after you anymore. And we're now at war, and we really cannot afford to keep the colonies. And so it was on the basis, it was written before the Second World War, but it was during that, I think, or whatever year it was, 42 or something, that Australia took it up because we needed to declare war against the Japanese. And then I think so did New Zealand, if they did. But it was that forced us to accept this business where they were telling us to please go away. And by then, I think we had the League of Nations, which became the Commonwealth of Nations about that same time. The business of the Citizenship Act, which is 49, a similar act I think was passed in other places, New Zealand and Canada. Now, this is where we declare that we can become Australian citizens. As to British subjects, we're now Australian citizens. Now, the date for that is January 26. And I argue that that is the date that we call Australia Day or Australians Day, because that's when you could become Australia. Because January 26, 1888, nothing happened whatsoever. Arthur put a flag in the sand for the rest of the fleet to know where to come from. It didn't mean anything to Aborigines, and the French were around the corner and couldn't see it. And it just says they got out the wine, they toasted the King's health as they watched the sunset. The big day was February the 7th, a week later, when everybody then, sat on the ground and they read the documents and the army played, the bands played and marched up and down. That was the big day. So, yes, I think there's some argument to be made that it's January 26, 1949 that becomes Australia Day, and we're sort of barking up literally the wrong tree when we're having protests about it. So, yeah, there's 4 documents that lead to our independence from Britain, and one of them being our Constitution. We keep it because it's now the functioning of our government. It's not now a document that ties us to the British Parliament.
I want to ask you a couple of aspects about the Constitution before we touch on maybe some reforms that we could propose. But the clause about water, which is clause 100, which is the right to use water, the Commonwealth shall not, by any law or regulation of trade or commerce, abridge the right of a state or the residents therein to the reasonable use of the waters of rivers for conservation or irrigation. So farmers point to this and say that this protects their water rights. But then Malcolm Roberts makes the argument that when John Howard wanted to bring in the Murray-Darling scheme and other privatization of water, that he went to the states to implement that, and it's not implemented by the federal government. Is that another example of this separation between the states and the federal powers?
Yes, it is. I wish I knew more. I was overseas at the time of what's happened with the selling of water and how we've got private companies or something owning the water. But clearly, there's an argument to make that unless the states have done it, the federal government, and maybe that's what happened. It's got nothing to do with the federal government. It's all states been selling off their water, you know. But yes, that's another one.
That's
another
how it is with the states,
Another one is education. Education is a state right. And it's a bit like that national council that Morrison got together, and he said, "Now let's get all the premiers together. We'll all hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and we'll all get around this pandemic business." Now I think they're still doing it, but it's again totally unconstitutional for the states all to be agreeing and saying, "Oh well, we may have individual powers, but it doesn't matter anymore." You know, that's just a real confrontative move. The other one's education. So the bureaucrats all got together with other bureaucrats in the states, and they said, how about we have an Australian education system? So they've all bought into the thing, which was really New South Wales's education system anyway, I understand. But it's sent our country down the gurgle. We've moved in the top 10 or something countries in the world. What is it now, 116 or 120 or something? And they have completely ruined our education system. Absolutely. Now, I wrote this book because I got asked to do something for primary school for Australian history, which was ridiculous anyway. I said, well, what are we going to do? Wacky Warriors or some other thing? You know, how are you going to teach Australian history for primary school? But it turned out that the children only get 6 months of Australian history, and it's mainly about New Zealand and all sorts of other woke sort of things. Well, where on earth are we going to teach us Australian history in school? So it's not taught. There isn't anything that's taught. I talked to the Shadow Minister for Education up here. I said, you really got to get Australian history back into the curriculum, because we're not being taught anything. And he said he wanted civics as well, because we know nothing about how the government functions. And I talked to an Indian woman outside church last Sunday, and I said, how did you vote? She said she voted Labor. And I said, why did you do that? She said, oh, well, I was listening to other people at work, and I heard them talking about it. But I know, here's the quote, absolutely nothing, even though I've been here for 20 years, about the Australian political system. Nobody's there telling them. Nobody's waving a flag and saying what a great country it is. And so I talked to David Christofouli before he got elected, and I mentioned this. He was giving a talk at some legal thing, and he tapped me on the shoulder. I said, we've got to take back education for Queensland. Don't have to take it back. It's already there. Just walk away from the Australia. Don't have to pass even legislation. Just do it. So he taps me on the shoulder and he says, and I want you to do it. I said, now everybody take note that he's actually asking me to do it. Well, I'm still waiting for the phone to ring. But it's there. He knows it. And I think it's a real sleeper of an issue for this country is your children, my children's future in education, because it's not worth a cracker across the world at the moment.
No, definitely not. Another thing I want to talk about is local governments. Now, a lot of people make the argument that local government isn't mentioned in the Australian Constitution. There were these referendums, I think about 3 referendums to include local government in the Constitution, and they were defeated. But my understanding is that local governments are in the state constitutions, and that's where local governments get their powers from.
Only legislation. It's only there's an act for the local council minister for, and so it's only there in legislation. It's not in constitutions. And everybody here on the Gold Coast, you can't mention the Gold Coast Council with everybody screwing up their faces. We all hate the Gold Coast Council up here because they're just so invasive with all their regulations. You see, here's something that's happened this week. I'm in Queensland, is that they've got a major problem here with housing. Know that? We know there's a problem. In the last so many years, 50,000 people who were renting space in their homes have stopped. Not 500, not 50,000 people in Queensland are no longer renting property. And they brought in a thing called the RTA, the Renters Tenants Rooming Accommodation or something Authority. Now, they've gone and even made it worse, where Karl Marx would be in shock if he read the forms. If you want to have someone living in your home, you need a Form 52. If you want to have them move out, you need a Form number 12. If you want to bang a nail in your wall, it's a Form such and such. You cannot, and the regulations are absolutely insane. That it's fascism. It's the worst of communism, that they can come into my home and tell me what I can and I cannot do. And a person who is off the street can walk in and they've suddenly got rights in my own home. So you've got to think, how do I get out of this? I'm not having people. The best thing they could do is get rid of the local councils, because, as you pointed out, they're illegitimate.
And also this view tax in the Gold Coast as well, where the higher
shocking.
up you are, the more you pay.
Oh, it's shocking. So they've been brought in for people against property owners or businesses, and it's just, as I said, you close up and go away.
Yeah,
because you just can't argue with all the regulations.
Look, there's a lot that we could unpack more about the Constitution, but I want to ask you more about reforms, because let's fast forward to now. Is our Constitution still fit for purpose, or is there things that we can do to it to make it better or function better? Do you have any ideas before maybe I start proposing some of my own?
Yeah, our biggest problem, well, there's several of them, the biggest problems, is that we are run by bureaucracy. And you pointed out earlier of a fellow that gets a job as a minister who doesn't have a clue what he's doing. So it becomes a yes minister thing. I remember working for a minister in New South Wales. He just got the job. He had all these great ideas. And there stood the bureaucrat who said, literally, that's a great and wonderful idea you have, Minister, but we have a financial commitment on this area for the next 3 years. And so we are already, funded for the next project to happen. But it's such a wonderful idea that you proposed. We'll be happy to consider it for the next round of funding after you're no longer elected and sitting in your chair. I mean, he was totally just cut off. There was nothing he could do as the minister because the bureaucrats were running it. And it just goes on and on all the time. In my book, I actually took a real shot at them and spent more than a page running the buggers down. And then I thought maybe that's a bit much. So I think I cut it down to one precise paragraph about how much the bureaucrats are running this country behind the scenes. And it's a major problem. It's the bureaucrats behind them. The other one we mentioned, another big problem we've got is not so much the shared sovereignty business where you've got certain powers, etc. But if we were going to be reformed and elect a Governor General, that is an executive officer, arose by any other name would be a president. So if we were going to elect a president independent of the Parliament. Now, remember, John Howard was put it all up and it was going to happen and people were feeling warm and fuzzy. And at the last minute, he came out and said, oh, but I'm going to appoint the president just like I'm doing the Governor General. And that's when he lost the vote for the referendum on us becoming a republic. Australia is happy if we vote for an independent executive officer. But it's no good us voting for an independent executive officer to run the government, fire the bureaucrats when you don't like them, if we keep that clause 64 hidden C. They shall all be members of the Parliament. There's no consideration till that there's a pen goes through that line. One is holding the hand of the other and must get rid of that 64 sentence, as well as then enable a vote for an executive officer. Because I think that in the current government situation, if you looked at the worst of the worst, where a government can, without any responsibility, put us into $1 trillion debt and so many policies that seem to be against the will of the nation. I'm just guessing at this point. You can see if the system is open for an autocrat. There's no doubt about it. Our Prime Minister can be an autocrat, and it can then open it up for an autocrat to be a tyrant in what they do, because there's so much power concentrated in that one office. So splitting it up again and giving an independent president does on paper make sense. Again, you can have a bad president, etc., etc. At the end of the book, I raised this issue, and I eventually had to conclude by saying to myself, we're never going to be able to have a republic in Australia for two reasons: money and power. No premier, no prime minister is going to give up their autocratic rule and hand it over to an individual that's been independently elected and lose their power and the control of the purse.
Well, that's why we started Australians for Better Government, to bypass the politicians and say we can't rely on them anymore to make political change in this country.
Yeah.
It has to come from a grassroots people's movement to drive change. But Australians for Better Governments agree. We feel that, and we propose that the Governor General should be elected by the Australian people, and we say the Attorney General should also be elected by the Australian people as well. But my question to you is, if we go back to Chapter 2 and we read Section 61, which outlines the executive power, it says the executive power of the Commonwealth is vested in the Queen and is exercisable by the Governor General as the Queen's representative. It's now the King, and extends to the execution and maintenance of this Constitution and of the laws of the Commonwealth. Now, the question is, if Australia was to elect the Governor General and the Governor General was still the Queen's representative, would we have to become a republic?
Yeah, you've raised a good issue, and that's why for my dissertation, for my PhD at the Claremont Graduate University, with several lawyers, one who was on the committee to make Czechoslovakia an independent country after the Second World War, so it was a top American legal mind, and the other one was Leonard Levy, America's top constitutional historian, and a few political philosophers thrown in. I rewrote the Australian Constitution so that we could function as a republic. And I wrote it with Republicans, not here in Australia with people going over the same old ground. I spent a couple of years working with top Republicans to reform that document, and called the book In the Shadow of the Crown. Now, I think I might have to touch up the website, but I wrote it when I was only 33, so I look back and sort of say, well, I wouldn't have really put that in, but it's not badly written. So if you're interested, you can rather read the last chapter of the current book, What a Capital Idea, if you're interested in it. Or if you want to actually see what our Constitution would look like as a republic. When I was getting it printed, the publisher wrote to me and said, but you can't do that. You can't just rewrite the Constitution. They said, this is the American publisher. And they said, you'll have to get permission from the Australian Parliament before you go, fiddling around with the document. I said, oh, all right, well then. So I sent a letter off to whoever it was in Canberra and said, this is what I want to do. And they wrote back and said, oh, have some fun, go for your life. So I sent it off to the publisher to say, well, yes, I can rewrite the Constitution. And that's what I've done. So these are the clauses that you mentioned that would have to be amended, deleted, changed, reform. That's what I deal with. So again, how would we take on those same sort of powers? How would we relinquish the stuff that's no longer relevant 150 years later?
But do we have to become a republic to elect the Governor General? Because the Governor General would still be the Queen.
I see. Could we elect the Governor General that would continue for us to be a constitutional monarchy? That is, the King would still, I like the idea, the King sits over the Governor General. We elect independently the Governor General, which also then cuts the power of the Prime Minister. And the Governor General not going to do what he's told, and he is going to run the Secretaries of State, cross out that 64B.
Yep. And I'm not against a republic, but this could be a halfway step, and you could go to a republic later. But for people that are worried about going to a republic, the constitutional monarchs out there, this could be a happy medium.
That works. You see, because in our Constitution, there's all these things called statutory powers. It's already written as to what the powers are. Then we have these reserve powers, which are this sort of nebulous sort of thing that comes through the letters patent. So, to what degree you keep or change them is a sort of a sub-issue. If you kept the principle that the Governor General was responsible to the King of Australia and independent of, as it was written, the legislature, without that funny little bridge that crosses over with that one sentence in 64, then yes, we could have a constitutional monarchy with an elected Governor General.
Yeah. And that elected Governor General would run the executive, and the Prime Minister and all these ministers would no longer be part of the executive.
Yeah, there'll be some spitting of dummies, mate.
Yeah.
Well, I don't like the sound of that, but yes, that would work. Now, what would be the advantage of that over becoming a full republic?
Well, I think it would appease the people out there that still want links to the monarchy.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing. You see, I remember reading a book by a socialist out of Melbourne, Stuart McIntyre, and although he sort of woked onto the book, he made a slip in the preface. And in his slip, he said, if we go and deny our British heritage, we will become a people without a soul. And I know there's a lot of people that really are looking for an alternative soul history, and that's what this romance with the Aboriginal religion is all about, and this make-believe history that goes back for thousands of years, etc. And I can understand that they're looking for something, grappling for anything other than our ties to Britain. But I think that we are, and always were, even when we became Australia as a nation, we were British. Up until 49, we were Britons. We were Britons and British subjects. And that included all the Aboriginal people here were considered Britons. Britons. And I'll tell you who said that. Henry Parkes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he said that. He talked about the Aborigines as Britons.
Why do you think there's no emphasis on Inglis Clark?
Don't know. I think it's because these other fellas put their names to the document, and even when they got him aside after that month, and Griffiths had his boat come down from Queensland, and he pulled it he came down to Sydney, and then he went up and he pulled it into the Hawkesbury River. Then he had Deakin come up from Sydney, and another fella, Fisher, I think, from South Australia. So these three premiers sat there with the young fella from Tasmania, and basically were going to sort of push him into the position of whatever they wanted. But they couldn't make a darn change. Not a change could they make to his document. So what actually? We'll form a committee. And then we'll sign the document as if it's ours. And the buggers didn't put a word in it. So it's all his. So it's one of those things that needs to be corrected.
Yeah. Just a quick few things. What's your view on a Bill of Rights? Like, that's one of the big things about the American Constitution. The first, 6 amendments or whatever it is the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
How do you feel about
it? Does it include the 13th Amendment where we get rid of the Gold Coast Council? That'd be the right. We have a right to vote out the Gold Coast Council. They're terrible bureaucrats, absolutely horrible. So yes, there's something about New Zealand's constitution which includes accepting of the British the Bill of Rights from 1676 or something. It's some really old document. I'm unfamiliar with it or what it says, but it's worth having a look at. I mean, most of the sort of things we think are in the Bill of Rights are sort of in our common law history are there. But yes, I don't think there's any argument to be made against codifying it.
Okay. What about the formation of new states? A lot of people, they're talking about splitting Queensland in two, or there's a guy that I interviewed that wants to break the Riverina away from New South Wales. Like, there is a provision in the Constitution to form more states.
Yeah.
Your view on
But
that?
if it's in Queensland, would it not be the state government and the people of Queensland that would decide to separate? I don't believe the federal government has the power to be cutting off and separating a piece of land, to be stepping over the sovereign right of a state.
So really a big part of this is not just reforming the Australian Constitution and the federal government. We need to reform the states as well, if we want to make any significant changes.
Yeah, I'm sort of the view that it's the states that are the fundamental political entity of this country. Boom. And then it was the states that formed the Federation. So the states still have the right to sort of say, like Western Australia keeps singing the song, we've had enough of you, or we're going to, what's the word?
Secede.
Yeah, secede from the Union. And they know they have the right and the power to do it.
And is that similar to the American system where?
Yeah. I think the states could do that too there. They could also, I mean, I don't know what sort of internal referendum system each state would have to have, but if you didn't have one, you could soon put it on the books. We're going to have a referendum and we've had enough of this.
Yeah. What about what about the history of referendums in this country? I understand that a lot of them have failed and they haven't done so well.
And when you have a look at them, I did do something on this when we did The Voice. I wrote something up of how many we've actually had, and it's some. I wish I could remember it, but it's something like, it's definitely most. I mean, there's only like 3 or 4 or something, if you can quickly look that up, that actually passed. But you'll also find that the majority of them were put up by the Labor Party. So I think they have like 100% of their referendum proposals fail. It's something like that, or 90-something%.
What about citizens-initiated referenda? Are you in favour?
Absolutely necessary. Absolutely necessary. And see, this is the funny thing. When we go and vote, this is a restraint on our democratic principles. We vote for the members of a parliament to make laws, but we do not have any power to tell the parliament what laws they can make. So, in fact, the High Court represents, unlike America, the High Court recognises that the Senate and the House of Representatives are legal entities, which meaning that people can actually sue the Australian Parliament as a legal entity, or the Senate or the House, where in America you couldn't, because they represent the people. Here they don't. So that needs to be fixed too. That there's no necessity for the Parliament to pass laws that the people want.
This is a question that's come through by Miss Silver, and this might be a whole separate podcast in itself. But Miss Silver says, can Dr. Reynolds talk more about the make-believe Aboriginal history? We might have to do that another time.
Yeah, that's a good one, isn't it? I had a friend, I don't know how long I can take, but they cut me down to just a couple of minutes, right?
Yeah.
When I was writing this book, I had a friend who's the ex-president of the Uniting Church, which, I hadn't realised being overseas that they've gone left of left, terribly woke. And so I was telling him what I was writing, and he kept saying, "Oh, Aborigines, oh, Aborigines." And I go, "What's the problem with the Aborigines?" I said, "All right, Dean, I'm going to stop the project, and I'm going to give you a whole chapter on the Aborigines." Now, I couldn't just sort of say I'm going to write about the Aborigines today, because I needed to write about them in the 1800s. So I wrote about the Aborigines at the time of settlement. Who were these people? What was their religion? How they, where were they, etc. Now, that was an honest appraisal of a people that the British came and met and lived with. But I mean, you then sort of read these comments by people that had been to the country, and it took me a while to sort of get hold of it, where they would say they were the most primitive people on earth, and they would call them savages. And even in the letters patent, that the king signed for Philip to come to Australia. He hadn't written it, but they'd used the word the savages, the king will look after the savages, and he crossed it out and wrote natives. But there was a common view, a perspective and understanding of the incredible violence among the people that were here, and the cannibalism. But it took a while to realise what was happening with the white settlers that were being abused and then killed. And it was the Aborigines were just poor, starving, wretched individuals, nowhere to sleep, out in the cold constantly, the diseases, the starvation, the infanticide, it went on and on the number of children that were raped and abused, domestic violence. 1/3 of all women were bashed to death. 1/3 of all Aboriginal women were murdered. And so I got to understand how the governors were trying to resist anything to try and be benevolent to a group of people that needed care. And something I was recently reading that even in that depression business of the 1890s, when the nation was in such devastated drought, and 1/3 of Victoria, I think, got up and went to Western Australia, men looking for work, there was still on the books legislation to care for the Aborigines. And so the comment was that it was the churches and the Caucasians that cared for Aborigines far more than any other Aboriginal tribe ever did, because there was, again, no concept of benevolence in the society. So we sort of missed the absolute need that people were in. And people did respond. It's not that there weren't very successful stories of Aborigines who just couldn't assimilate into Australian society, as it were, the colonial society, fast enough. And even Arthur Phillip got on so well with the Aborigines that they made him an Aboriginal elder within 2 years of him being here, as you may have heard, and gave him the name Wallawarri. And Bennelong didn't call him governor or sir, he called him father. And he was the one that conducted the little service or ceremony or something, smoke or something, that made him the elder of his tribe. So that's it. It was also important, because it wasn't him saying, oh, look, I've now got a white stripe on my forehead. It wasn't that. In becoming an elder, they were giving him, and were pleased to give him, responsibility for their people. And he's seen as the elder for the Caucasians, the whites, and now he was seen as the elder with responsibilities for that particular tribe. And we're missing it not to understand that he was taking on that role, and they wanted him to care for them.
Miss Silver's followed up with a comment. Thank you for answering. I have heard the whispers, but never heard that it was true. So
yeah, read the book. There's 3 sections in the book. That I dealt with one, and then I had to come back. And as you heard me say before, Aborigines were voting for the referendum for us to federate. And what missed going on. What was going on?
What about the rumor out there, or the conspiracy theory? I don't know if you've heard it, about Australia being a corporation, and this was brought in by Gough Whitlam in the 1970s, and the Australia Act had something to do with it. Like, have you?
Well, if Australia was a corporation, it'd be filing for bankruptcy. I mean, you got $1 trillion debt. I mean, who's going to buy it? In terms of, oh yeah, Mum, I've got this new option down the road. They're selling it at 1 cent a share. I mean, it's in such a mess. What has actually happened is that where we had a lot of government control of our resources, and whether it was the water, the electricity, I got to think what else is in there. The railway system, have we given away education yet? We've sold them all off. Now, what the tragedy is, it's not that we've lost control of those things. And I can understand the unions were driving the government mad, and the regulations, etc., that they'd written for themselves. It wasn't just that. It was the fact that with the money they got for privatisation, it disappeared. It wasn't that they paid off a debt or built something new, and we took capital money and invested it in capital, but we went and invested in all sorts of social programs. And we have a massive problem in this country, whether we realise it or not, and we do, and when we were happy with it, but we live off the sale of our dirt, and our taxes that run this country come off the things that we sell overseas. I'm talking about coal and iron ore and other minerals, because I think someone said to me, and someone can correct me, is that 1/3 of Australians work to support the other 2/3?
Yeah, it's
I mean,
something
that's
like
a
that.
phenomenally disgraceful statistic when we look at it, that it's, if that's the truth, that we have such a huge social welfare system that assess you the taxes by some that support the rest.
Yeah. Miss Silver says, what is the name of the book? The name of the book is What a Capital Idea. Just again, the website is reynoldslearning.com, and you can follow the link.
Steve, they only have to even look up the word "What a Capital Idea" on their phones. It will all come up. They can watch the video. They can see me speaking. But here's something I said before. If they go to actually press the button that says, buy this book, and then it says coupon code or something, if they put in 1770, I'll give them a 25% discount. And that brings it down to $80.
That's awesome. And I'll put the link in the show notes as well if anyone's interested. Look, final thing. I think this is kind of relevant to what we've been talking about. But it's not completely about Australia. It's more about America. The King Charles's invitation to Donald Trump about joining the Commonwealth. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah. When Donald was in the last time, the comeback kid, when he was in the last time, and I was watching what was going on and the alliances, the AUKUS business and the strengthening with, let's get Britain and Australia and America together and we'll do a submarine deal even if somebody else can make a mess of it. We've got the Five Eyes, even though New Zealand's got a patch over one and telling people what they shouldn't be. But if you watch what was happening, England had recently gotten out of Brexit. Now, the business was complaining because they lost so much money and trade. And there was an opportunity there that I thought America was thinking of walking into, and that was a relationship with Britain. And that hasn't stopped. And here comes Donald, and it's on the table again. And I think if I get the statistics right, that the American economy turns over about $14 trillion a year. If it joins the Commonwealth of Nations will turn over $40 trillion a year. So where's the money in all of this? But you see, if the letter from the King to Donald to say, why don't you come to dinner? We'll sit down and have a bit of a chat and a sherry afterwards, and we can, have a bit of think about you rejoining the empire. I mean, the Commonwealth. Right? But that's what it's being said, isn't it? I mean, that history's still there, that a lot of Americans didn't want to get out of the empire and financially didn't. So here you've got then the opportunity, the doors open for America to tie back in with Mother England, which I really think Donald wants to do. He holds up his letter. I've got one too. I can now. I've got one too. Donald's got his and I've got mine from the King. Only he got an invitation to lunch. I only got thank you for the book. But yes, I think that was all worked out before the King would even think about embarrassing himself and sending a letter where Donald say, "Oh no, thanks, mate, we've got one." So it's on, and Donald wants to do it. Now, how would that happen? There's a process from the Commonwealth side that you're in as a sort of an initiate for a couple of years, as long as it all works out. But I think when it comes to America, it would also then obviously need the legislature. That's just not an executive decision. And then we could wait for the lawsuits.
Yeah.
He gets sued over everything. He gets sued over everything else.
And I'm sure the Democrats wouldn't be happy about it either.
But I mean, the money's there. I mean, but what do you end up with? We end up with an alliance, as we did century or plus ago. Our social, our legal, our language, and our political system are so similar. As we've had this discussion tonight. But economically and defence, you now have a globe that again you can go around and colour pink, and the sun won't set on the Commonwealth of Nations again like it was. So it's a fascinating turn of events that we're experiencing at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Thank you for coming on. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I guess the final question is, how does our constitution compare to other countries out there? Do you like the Australian constitution?
Yeah.
Maybe you mentioned that Israel has a constitution. And
Yeah, I mean, we
Canada
didn't
and
get
New
into
Zealand.
it as right, but I sort of touched on the fact that this has sort of been an evolving political process. And Canada was the first sort of thing, where they experimented with the provinces coming together and it worked out well, and said, well, get New South Wales to do the same thing. And New Zealand was sort of always there. It sort of did, it's got like 4 bits of paper instead of writing a constitution. But it was always just British. There wasn't a question about it. Yes, even Israel, the Israeli constitution was written by the British Parliament. So it's a different sort of a format, as and the American one as well. And then there's a stack of countries that have copied the American model. Now, I remember, reading the Irish Constitution. It's not a constitution, a Declaration of Independence in an Irish pub here on the Gold Coast. And while you've got a Guinness in your hand, you can read through, the Declaration of Independence. And you've got to say, I've got one beer in my hand, but whoever wrote this definitely had 2 or 3 before they put pen to paper. It really is. I think it's got Mother Mary, not Mother Mary, Mother Murphy or something. It's incredibly sort of, we're really all emotionally uptight and we're all going to do this sort of thing. So lots of countries have had to go at copying what became a fundamental document. And you heard me read when we began a quote from Aristotle 2,500 years ago. But when you read the Jefferson letters and documents and the rules of parliamentary order by Jefferson, which is this incredibly thick book, there is no faulting the intelligence of these people who wrote it. Some brilliant minds, and we do well. I think in the book I say when we did our constitution, we didn't have our Hamiltons, our Washingtons, and our Jeffersons, but we had Andrew Inglis Clark.
Yeah. Well, Innocent Bystander, that's an interesting name on YouTube, makes a comment. Our constitution needs a lot of work. It was written it was written really poorly for a bunch of lawyers. Wink. Do you think that's a fair comment?
No, I don't think Inglis Clark was an idiot. And I don't think that there was 50 years of evolution of parliamentary procedure and economics and a slow move towards democracy that can be just negated. And if someone's interested, if they can contact me, I can send them an ebook copy of that little book I wrote called The Shadow of the Crown, where I rewrite the document, and I'm only there and too pleased for people to have a look and consider it. As I said, I wrote it quite some time ago, but certainly in the back of What a Capital Idea, I try to spell it out from a I don't have an opinion. I'm just writing it out so we can all understand what our Constitution is about. But I think it's a couple of chapters before that I run through how we happen to have a Constitution. I think this is a great country. And I mean, we haven't had a civil war. We didn't have the riots on the street that England had as they moved towards democracy. We were able, as a country, to have all the states agree that we're moving ahead. Yes, we've had people put up referendum and most of them have been knocked on the head. We're a conservative sort of country. We have defended our country. Anzac Day every year says there's more and more people coming out. People are proud to be in this country. And I think, yes, we could certainly, it's time to do something about our system of government because it's a bit old hat. But I think your suggestion of actually keeping a Governor General is a good compromise. But I think we need to do something about the power of the Parliament. But I think we have a very good, strong document that we can, as it were, play with and improve our country as we move forward. I'm proud to be an Australian.
Yeah, so am I, and that was well said. Probably a good way to finish up the discussion tonight. So thank you very much, Dr. Reynolds, for coming on again. You're amazing to listen to, and I always enjoy listening to you, and I know the audience does as well. So it's much appreciated. And to let everyone know again for a final time, and I encourage everyone to do this, head to reynoldslearning.com and get a copy of the book, What a Capital Idea. as Dr. Reynolds says, there's a coupon code 1770 if you want to get that discount. Brings the price down to about $80. And I've got a copy of the book. I've got the copy of the book right here, and it's fantastic. It's amazing, and it's just as good as listening to the man in person. So thanks, mate. I appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll have you on again to talk about something else going forward, because you've got.
Let's see what Donald does next week.
I can't keep up with it all. With the Australian election,
it's better than Netflix.
That's for certain. That's for sure.
All right.
Good night, mate. Yeah, good night to you, and good night to the audience, and we'll see you all next time. See you later.